Learn how to take your caring and giving farther with the Caring and Funding Podcast, powered by CAF America. CAF America, America's leader in cross-border philanthropy, helps corporations, foundations, wealth advisors, and individuals donate to charities around the world, ensuring that gifts are made safely, legally, and with the greatest impact. Now, the host of CAF America's Caring and Funding Podcast, CAF America President and CEO, Ted Hart.
Our guest today is one of the foremost experts in nonprofit law and is the brilliant mind that CAF America turns to for legal advice in all areas of international grant making. David Shevlin is a partner at Simpson Thacher and Bartlett and is head of the exempt organizations practice there. Dave, why is it so much more complex to give to an international charity?
If I, as an individual, want to make a gift to a charity and claim a tax deduction, I have to make a gift to a charity that's organized in the United States, even if it's operating or supporting activities outside the United States. As a result, the Internal Revenue Service is responsible for ensuring that U.S. charities don't act as mere conduits for U.S. donors to effectively make a gift to a foreign charity without the U.S. organization exercising some discretion and control. A conduit is an organization that isn't exercising its own fiduciary discretion and oversight over the contributions that it receives and merely acts as a pass-through. We're very careful to ensure that even if the donor wishes to express a preference or a request as to where the funds should ultimately go abroad, that the U.S. charity has appropriate protocols and procedures in place so that they are not labeled by the Internal Revenue Service as a conduit.
Now, the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS in the United States, has provided guidance and regulations that guide how grants can be made internationally and qualify for a tax deduction. Those are two protocols. One is expenditure responsibility, the other is equivalency determination. Let's start by talking about expenditure responsibility. And the reason that I choose that one first is because everyone thinks you must have equivalency determination as if it were the only protocols. What is ER, or expenditure responsibility?
Expenditure responsibility is a process by which a private foundation or a donor-advised fund can make a grant to an organization that's not a public charity, as determined by the Internal Revenue Service, and that includes foreign organizations, foreign charities, if they follow a multi-step process. And that process includes a pre-grant inquiry by the private foundation, essentially a due diligence exercise of the foreign grantee, an agreement with the foreign grantee that has to contain certain provisions, including provisions to protect the foundation from having its funds diverted, an obligation by the grantee to submit certain reports back to the funder, and a requirement that the funder on its U.S. tax return, which for private foundations is the 990-PF, for sponsoring organizations of DAFs is the 990, that they report on the expenditure responsibility grants that they had made in the taxable reporting period.
Where it becomes quite useful and important is in the international space, where international charities, which may have projects that are fully charitable, would meet with the approval of the IRS under this protocol, but might not, in fact, be equivalent to a U.S. charity. So does this make it a lesser protocol or one that stands side by side to equivalency determination?
I think you've hit it right. It's a complementary process. They sit side by side, and different circumstances and different types of organizations call for one or the other.
Because they look at different things, but are meant to qualify and validate that, in fact, the dollars that are seeking to qualify for a tax deduction in the United States are, in fact, going for charitable purposes and will be managed as a charitable activity, perhaps by a charitable organization. Why does it appear that there is more about equivalency determination on the United States than there is about expense responsibility?
Equivalency has undergone some recent regulatory tweaking, if you will, and there's been a great deal more activity in terms of folks looking for more efficient ways to collaborate on their equivalency processes, who's qualified and not qualified to give an equivalency determination, has led to, I think, a good deal more publicity around ED. It is not a prerequisite to obtain an equivalency determination to make a foreign grant.
Correct. I'll give an example to our listeners. We had a major Fortune 500 company who came to us. They had a list of 30 charities that they knew that they wanted to contribute to, and they had worked with another provider who had appeared to sort of validate that you must have equivalency determination. Half of the charities did not qualify. And so they were told that they could, in fact, not contribute to those charities. They thankfully found CAF America, and we looked at the list, and we went through the process. Some of the charities were already qualified with CAF America, so they were really quite pleased. They could start making grants immediately. But we were able to qualify all of the charities because we work both with ER and ED. And what I often describe is the expense responsibility looks at the charitable activity itself, and therefore has the flexibility to be able to look at all sorts of kinds of projects that could, in fact, qualify, whereas equivalency determination is looking at the charitable entity itself to determine if it, in fact, if it were in the U.S., could, in fact, be found to be equivalent to a U.S. 501c3 charity. Is that too simplistic?
No, I think what's important for people to understand and bear in mind is equivalency means that the entity is equivalent not just of a 501c3, but of a public charity in the United States. People sometimes say to me, if something is not available for an equivalency determination, how could you get satisfied that it would pass ER? And it's for the reason that you just said, which is the organization may not be literally and strictly the equivalent of a public charity, or the process to get there may just be too onerous and expensive. But the activity that you're intending to support is indeed charitable, and as long as you obtain the necessary documentation in the form of an agreement and report, and you've done your due diligence to ensure that your funds will be so spent, then you've satisfied the expenditure responsibility requirements.
So, again, both protocols are extremely important and are tools in the toolbox that make sure that not only the regulations of the IRS are followed, but also seeks to provide a structure and support for the donor in ensuring that the money is spent correctly.
The tax code is an important element of an U.S. charitable organization's activities outside the United States. That said, we have several regulatory regimes, and I'll just start by naming a few. There's the Patriot Act, which penalizes and criminalizes funding, including through humanitarian support of activities that facilitate terrorist activities. We have Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which criminalizes the payments of foreign government officials to obtain a business advantage. And we have the OFAC regime, which sanctions certain activities in specific countries, and in certain countries, even to engage in humanitarian activities, you need a license.
Dave, what is a grant agreement? Is it required? What should they cover? Why is this a topic that would be part of this discussion today?
A grant agreement is a contract between the funder, in our scenario that we're talking about today, the U.S. funder, and the grantee. Expenditure responsibility requires that you have a grant agreement that clearly specifies the purposes of the grant and requires the grantee to repay amounts that aren't used for the grant, to submit reports, and to keep records, and to prohibit the grantee from using the funds for non-charitable purposes, including lobbying, political activities, or of the like. Without an agreement, you're not obtaining the representations and warranties and confirming that the grantee assures you that the funds wouldn't be spent for non-permissible purposes. So regardless of whether or not I'm following ER, why wouldn't I want the grantee to contractually obligate itself to me that it will use the funds for the specified purposes that we have in writing what those purposes are, and that we have representations as to their ability to comply with their applicable laws, etc. So to me, it doesn't take much convincing when I'm speaking with a client to say, even if we're going down the equivalency route, we're going to have a grant agreement with this grantee to lay out all the terms of the grant.
There are other things that you need to take into consideration, such as regranting and lobbying. And where does that fall into the regulatory regime?
So regranting is as the term would imply, is the situation where you're making a grant to an organization, and either with respect to the whole grant or part of the grant, they're going to on-grant it to another organization. And the way expenditure responsibility works in particular is that if there is regranting, there has to be expenditure responsibility of what we call the secondary grantee. So you do have to be on the lookout for whether regranting is contemplated or part of the process. While public charities can engage in an insubstantial amount of lobbying, private foundations may not. So it's important that when a private foundation funds an organization, if it's funding a specific project, that it knows that the funds that it's funding are not being used for any lobbying portion of that project. When a private foundation makes a grant, whether it be a grant that we use equivalency or expenditure responsibility for, I want to know that my client's funds aren't being used to support activities that they wouldn't be able to support here in the United States, such as lobbying. So that's an important part of that process.
It's an important part. Another important part is reporting. So what is reporting? What are the requirements? And beyond requirements, what are best practices?
The answer to should I get a report is yes, regardless of the process that you follow. We've spoken quite a bit here today about all of the external legal and regulatory issues that overlay grant making outside the United States, such that it's common sense to obtain a report that shows you the evidence that the grantee used the funds for the purposes for which you intended them to be used. So that's a should in all cases. The must is in the expenditure responsibility scenario, where you are required by the terms of the regulations to obtain a report, financial and a narrative report, on an annual basis, plus at the conclusion of the grant. So you are required to get the report pretty much for the life of the grant.
How would you wrap up your best advice for those who are looking to give outside of the United States?
I would say, number one, be conscious of the tax regulations which require you to have a robust diligence and contractual and reporting process, regardless of which path you choose to grant outside the United States. Number two, be aware of the significant non-tax legal concerns that exist for grant making outside the United States, including Patriot Act and OFAC, and understand that equivalency is an excellent tool, but it is not the only tool, and it is not in and of itself a sufficient and exclusive tool to use.
Dave Shevlin, partner at Simpson Thacher, one of the bright lights in international grant making, and certainly helps us here at CAF America to serve all of our clients in the very best way we can. I want to thank you so much for being my guest here today.
My pleasure, Ted.
You've been listening to the Caring and Funding Podcast, powered by CAF America. You can find all of our podcasts at cafamerica.org, on iTunes, and on TuneIn. You can even say, Alexa, play CAF America on TuneIn. Thanks for listening.